Well, good evening, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. Later, we're going to talk about Lewis himself. But the primary focus this evening is on his masterpiece, really one of his many masterpieces, the SCREWTAPE Letters. On July 21st, 1940, it was a Sunday, and Lewis was attending the communion service at Holy Trinity Church, his parish in Headington Quarry, Oxford. Sometime during that service, he was struck by the idea for a book of letters. Sometime during a communion service, Lewis was struck by an idea for a series of letters from a senior devil, SCREWTAPE, to an apprentice tempter, his nephew Wormwood, in which, quote, the idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. Lewis would deliver all 31 letters by Christmas to The Guardian, at that time a religious weekly that published them serially from May through November 1941, during the darkest days and nights of the London Blitz. Uncle SCREWTAPE was an immediate hit. The publisher Geoffrey Bless brought out the book in Britain in 1942, and Macmillan brought it out here in 1943. By 1947, Lewis was on the cover of Time magazine with the image of a small devil on his shoulder. Now, Lewis believed in the devil, and believed that the devil paid attention to us. So he decided to pay some attention of his own, and asked, just what does this malignity see? The result is simple. These, remember, are intercepted letters. We have secret information, and it is about us. Patience, P-A-T-I-E-N-T-S, in the language of hell. That is prospective food for the devil. A young man is in a big city during wartime. Unbeknownst to him, he is under spiritual attack by Wormwood, who is both invisible and inaudible to the young man. The tempter can influence the man's intellect and imagination, but cannot work directly on his will. The man is always a free agent. As it happens, Wormwood is something of a bumbler. Which bumbling becomes all the clearer as Uncle SCREWTAPE becomes increasingly undone. So intertwined stories move us forward. That of the young man, of course, whose very soul is at stake, and that of Wormwood, who may or may not become food for his vexed uncle. Lewis would never write another letter of the sort in this book, having produced one of the great satires in the language, at once a psychological film, a theological study, and a satire mocking the great adversary himself. He knew to get out, while the getting was good. After all, when asked how he knew all about temptation, he said, that was easy. I just looked into my own mind and heart. That must have been some communion service. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Uncle SCREWTAPE.
From letter number 1. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding our patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing, and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing around inside his head. He doesn't seem to think of doctrines primarily as true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think materialism is true. Make him think it is strong, or stark, or courageous. That it is a philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too. Whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he's been shown for centuries to be greatly inferior to of our own Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to, in the end, to be in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal truths and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experience. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. You begin to see the point. Thanks to processes, which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar, while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been many sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But best of all, let him read no science, but give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
Letter number 3. My dear Wormwood. 1. Keep his mind on the inner life. He thinks his conversion is something inside him, and his attention is therefore chiefly turned at present to the states of his own mind, or rather to that very expurgated version of them, which is all you should allow him to see. Encourage this. Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate that most useful human characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. 2. It is, no doubt, impossible to prevent his praying for his mother, but we have means of rendering the prayers innocuous. Make sure that they are always very spiritual, that he is always concerned with the state of her soul and never with her rheumatism. 2 advantages follow. In the first place, his attention will be kept on what he regards as her sins, by which, with a little guidance from you, he can be induced to mean any of her actions which are inconvenient or irritating to himself. Thus, you can keep rubbing the wounds of the day a little sorer even while he is on his knees. The operation is not at all difficult, and you will find it very entertaining. In the second place, since his ideas about her soul will be very crude and often erroneous, he will, in some degree, be praying for an imaginary person, and it will be your task to make that imaginary person daily less and less like the real mother, the sharp-tongued old lady at the breakfast table. In time, you may get the cleavage so wide that no thought or feeling from his prayers for the imagined mother will ever flow over into his treatment of the real one. I've had patients of my own so well in hand that they could be turned at a moment's notice from impassioned prayer for a wife's or son's soul to beating or insulting the real wife or son without a qualm. 3. When two humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring it fully into the consciousness of your patient, that particular lift of his mother's eyebrows, which he learned to dislike in the nursery. And let him think how much he dislikes it. Let him assume that she knows how annoying it is and does it to annoy. If you know your job, you will not notice the immense improbability of the assumption. And, of course, never let him suspect that he has tones of voice and looks which similarly annoy her. As he cannot see or hear himself, that is easily managed. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
From letter number 9. My dear Wormwood, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times, or in ways, or in degrees, which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. It is more certain, and it's better style. To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return, that is what really gladdens our Father's heart, and that draws the time to begin the process. You see the idea? Keep his mind off the plain antithesis between true and false. Nice, shadowy expressions. It was a phase. I've been through all that. And don't forget the blessed word, adolescent. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
Letter number 13. My dear Wormwood, on your own showing, you first of all allowed the patient to read a book he really enjoyed, because he enjoyed it, and not in order to make clever remarks about it to his new friends. In the second place, you allowed him to walk down to the old mill and have tea there, a walk through country he really likes, and taken alone. In other words, you allowed him two real, positive pleasures. Were you so ignorant as not to see the danger of this? The characteristic of pains and pleasures is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. Thus, if you had been trying to damn your man by the romantic method, by making him a kind of child herald or Werther submerged in self-pity for imaginary distresses, you would try to protect him at all costs from any real pain. Because, of course, 5 minutes genuine toothache would reveal the romantic sorrows for the nonsense they were and unmask our whole stratagem. But you were trying to damn your patient by the world. That is, by palming off vanity, bustle, irony, and expensive tedium as pleasures. How can you have failed to see that a real pleasure was the last thing you ought to have let him meet? As a preliminary to detaching him from the enemy, you wanted to detach him from himself, and had made some progress in doing so. Now, all that is undone. The deepest likings and impulses of any man are the raw material, the starting point with which the enemy has furnished him. To get him away from those is therefore always a point gained. Even in things indifferent, it is always desirable to substitute the standards of the world, or convention, or fashion, for a human's own real likings and dislikings. I myself could carry this very far. I would make it a rule to eradicate from my patient any strong personal taste which is not actually a sin, even if it is something quite trivial, such as a fondness for cricket, or collecting stamps, or drinking cocoa. Such things, I grant you, have nothing of virtue in them. But there is a sort of innocence and humility and self-forgetfulness about them which I distrust. The man who truly and disinterestedly enjoys anything in the world for its own sake and without caring twopence what other people say about it is by that very fact forearmed against some of our subtlest modes of attack. You should always try to make the patient abandon the people or food or books he really likes in favor of the best people, the right food, the important books. I have known a human defended from strong temptations to social ambition by a still stronger taste for tripe and onions. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
From letter 15. My dear Wormwood, the humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things: to eternity itself, to that point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which the time touches eternity. Of the present moment, and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone, freedom and actuality are offered them. He would therefore have them continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. Our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, which has a determinative nature and to that extent resembles eternity. It is far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to them, so that in making them think about it, we make them think of unrealities. In a word, the future is, of all things, the thing least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time, for the past is frozen and no longer flows, and the present is all lit up with eternal rays. Hence the encouragement we have given to all those schemes of thought, such as creative evolution, scientific humanism, or communism, which fix men's affections on the future, on the very core of temporality. Hence, nearly all vices are rooted in the future. Gratitude looks to the past, and love to the present. Fear, avarice, lust, and ambition look ahead. Do not think lust an exception. When the present pleasure arrives, the sin, which alone interests us, is already over. The pleasure is just the part of the process which we regret, and would exclude if we could do so without losing the sin. It is the part contributed by the enemy, and therefore experienced in the present. The sin, which is our contribution, looked forward. No natural phenomenon is really in our favor. In any way, why should the creature be happy? Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
Letter number 21. My dear Wormwood, you must therefore zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption, my time is my own. Let him have the feeling that he starts each day as the lawful possessor of 24 hours. Let him feel as a grievous tax that portion of this property which he has to make over to his employers, and as a generous donation that further portion which he allows to religious duties. But what he must never be permitted to doubt is that the total from which these deductions have been made was, in some mysterious sense, his own personal birthright. You have here a delicate task. The assumption which you want him to go on making is so absurd that, if once it is questioned, even we cannot find a shred of argument in its defense. The man can neither make nor retain one moment of time. It all comes to him by pure gift. he might as well regard the sun and moon his chattels. He is also, in theory, committed a total service of the enemy. And if the enemy appeared to him in bodily form and demanded that total service for even one day, he would not refuse. He would be greatly relieved if that one day involved nothing harder than listening to the conversation of a foolish woman. And he would be relieved almost to the pitch of disappointment if for 1/2 hour in that day the enemy said, "Now, you may go and amuse yourself." And all the time, the joke is that the word mine, in its fully possessive sense, cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, either our Father or the enemy will utter mine of each thing that exists, and especially of each man. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong. Certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything on the pedantic, legalistic ground that he made it. Our Father hopes in the end to say mine of all things on the more realistic and dynamic ground of conquest. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
From letter number 22. My dear Wormwood, if you are reckoning on me to secure my good offices, you will find yourself mistaken. You shall pay for that as well as for your other blunders. Meanwhile, I enclose a little booklet, just issued on the new House of Correction for incompetent tempters. It is profusely illustrated, and you will find not a dull page in it. I have looked up this girl's dossier, and am horrified at what I find. Not only a Christian, but such a Christian. A vile, sneaky, simpering, demure, monosyllabic, mouse-like, watery, insignificant, virginal bread and butter miss. The little brute. She makes me vomit. She stinks and scalds through the very pages of the dossier. It drives me mad, the way the world has worsened. We'd have had her to the arena in the old days. That's what her sword is made for. Not that she'd do much good there either. A two-faced little cheat, I know the sort, who looks as if she'd faint at the sight of blood and then dies with a smile. A cheat every way. Looks as if butter would melt in her mouth, and yet has a satirical wit. The sort of creature who'd find me funny. Filthy, insipid little prude, and yet ready to fall into this booby's arm like any other breeding animal. Why doesn't the enemy blast her for it, be so moonstruck by virginity, instead of looking on there, grinning? He's a hedonist at heart. All those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only a facade. We're only like foam on a seashore. Out at sea, out in his sea, there is pleasure and more pleasure. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. Ugh! I don't think he is the least inkling of that high and austere mystery which we rise to in the miserific vision. He's vulgar, Wormwood. He has a bourgeois mind. He has filled his world full of pleasures. There are things for humans to do all day long without his minding in the least. Sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, playing, praying, working. Everything has to be twisted before it's any use to us. We fight under cruel disadvantages. Nothing is naturally on our side. Not that that excuses you. I'll settle with you presently. You have always hated me and been insolent when you dared. Then, of course, he gets to know this woman's family and the whole circle. Could you not see that the very house she lives in is the one you ought never to have entered? The whole place reeks of that deadly odor. The very gardener, the one who's only been there for 5 years, is beginning to acquire it. Even guests, after a weekend visit, carry some of the smell away from them. The dog and the cat are tainted with it. And a house full of the impenetrable mystery. We are certain it is a matter of first principles that each member of the family must in some way be making capital out of the others. But we really can't find out how. They guard as jealously as the enemy himself the secret of what really lies behind this pretense of disinterested love. The whole house and garden is one vast obscenity. It bears a sickening resemblance to the description one human writer made of heaven, the regions where there is only life, and therefore all is not music. That is not music, is silence. Music, silence. How I detest them both. How thankful we should be that ever since our father entered hell, though no longer than most humans reckoning in light years could express, no square inch of infernal space and no moment of infernal time has been surrendered to either of those abominable forces, but all has been occupied by noise. Noise, that grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Noise, which alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end. Meanwhile, the disgusting little... And here the manuscript breaks off and is resumed in a different hand. In the heat of composition, I find that I have been inadvertently allowed myself to assume the form of a large centipede. I am accordingly taking the rest of my secretary. Now that the transformation is complete, I recognize it to be as a periodical phenomenon. In my present form, I feel ever more anxious to see you, to unite you to myself in an indissoluble embrace. Signed, Touhey, for his abysmal sublimity under Secretary SCREWTAPE, TEBS, etc.
Letter number 25. My dear Wormwood, the real trouble about the set your patient is living in is that it is merely Christian. They all have individual interests, of course, but the bond remains mere Christianity. What we want, if men become Christians at all, is to keep them in a state of mind I call Christianity and. You know. Christianity and the crisis. Christianity and the new psychology. Christianity and the new order. Christianity and faith healing. Christianity and psychical research. Christianity and vegetarianism. Christianity and spelling reform. If they must be Christians, let them at least be Christians with a difference. A substitute for the faith itself, some fashion with a Christian coloring. Work on their horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart. An endless source of heresies in religion, folly in counsel, infidelity in marriage, and inconsistency in friendship. The humans live in time and experience reality successively. To experience much of it, therefore, they must experience many different things. In other words, they must experience change. And since they need change, the enemy, being a hedonist at heart, has made change pleasurable to them, just as he has made eating pleasurable. But since he does not wish to make change, any more than eating, an end in itself, he has balanced the love of change in them by a love of permanence. He has contrived to gratify both tastes together on the very world he has made, by that union of change and permanence which we call rhythm. He gives them seasons, each season different, yet every year the same, so that spring is always felt as a novelty, yet always as the recurrence of an immemorial theme. He gives them in his church a spiritual ear, the change from a fast to a feast, but it is the same feast as before. But the greatest triumph of all is to elevate his horror of the same old thing into a philosophy, so that nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption in the will. It is here that the general evolutionary or historical character of modern European thought, partly our work, comes in so useful. The enemy loves platitudes. Of a proposed course of action, he wants men, so far as I can see, to ask very simple questions. Is it righteous? Is it prudent? Is it possible? Now, if we can keep men asking, Is it in accordance with the general movement of our time? Is it progressive or reactionary? Is this the way that history is going? They will neglect the relevant questions. Once, they knew that some changes were for the better, and others for the worse, and others again indifferent. We have largely removed this knowledge. For the descriptive adjective unchanged, we have substituted the emotional adjective stagnant. We have trained them to think of the future as a promised land which favored heroes attain, not as something which everyone reaches at the rate of 60 minutes an hour, whatever he does, whoever he is. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
From letter number 30. My dear Wormwood, probably the scenes he is now witnessing will not provide the material for an intellectual attack on his faith. Your previous failures have put that out of your power. But there is a sort of attack on the emotions which we can still try. It turns on making him feel, when he first sees human remains plastered on a wall, that this is the world as it really is like, and that all his religion has been a fantasy. You will notice that we have got them completely fogged about the meaning of the word real. They tell each other of some great spiritual experience. All that has really happened is that you heard some music in a lighted building. Here, real means the bare physical facts, separated from the other elements in the experience they actually had. On the other hand, they will also say, it's all very well discussing that high dive as you sit there in an armchair, but wait till you get up there and see what it's really like. Here, real is being used in the opposite sense, to mean not the physical facts, which they know already while discussing the matter in their armchairs, but the emotional effects that those facts will have on a human consciousness. Either application of the word could be defended, but our business is to keep the two going at once, so that the emotional value of the word real can be placed now on one side of the account, now on the other, as it happens to suit us. Your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE.
Letter number 31. My dear, my very dear Wormwood, my puppet, my pig's name. As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back, dizzy and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it. That this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Well, perhaps you would hope that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one of them had played at many an hour in his life when he had supposed himself alone. So that now he could say to them one by one, not, "Who are you?" but, "So it was you all along." All they were and said at this meeting woke memories. The dim consciousness of friends about him, which had haunted his solitudes from infancy, was now at last explained. That central music and every pure experience, which had always just evaded memory, was now at last recovered. Recognition made him free of their company, almost before the limbs of his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. Once more, the inexplicable meets us. Next to the curse of useless tempters like yourself, the greatest curse upon us is the failure of our intelligence department. If only we could find out what he's really up to. Oh, alas, alas, that knowledge, in itself so hateful and mawkish a thing, should yet be necessary for power. Sometimes I'm almost in despair. All that sustains me is the conviction that our realism, our rejection in the face of all temptations, of all silly nonsense and claptrap, must win in the end. Meanwhile, I have you to settle with. Most truly do I sign myself, your increasingly and ravenously affectionate uncle. Screwtape.
I don't know whose bright idea it was for me to follow that. Probably Angelo's. It's a hard act to follow. Decompensation by a devil into a centipede, and the delivery to glory of a living soul is especially hard to follow, not least when presented so evocatively as by John and Jeremy. Thank you both again. But in the event, I have been asked to share a few thoughts on this very great book, which has never been out of print. And the first of those thoughts is a question. What sort of genius could pull this off? Well, Lewis's presiding genius, the chairman of his board of geniuses, so to speak, was rhetoric. Whether by argument, description, exposition, or imaginative enticement, Lewis was ever persuasive. And persuasion, as Aristotle has taught us, is the heart of rhetoric. Always, Lewis marshaled language in adaptation to his subject, to his venue, and type of communication, whether sermon, book review, lay theology, public address, BBC broadcast. Well, you get the idea. In short, his was a militant intellect, and he is a warrior in words who knew to scout his terrain and adjust accordingly. That is the sort of genius Lewis was. In Screwtape, he provides intellectual engagement, the satisfaction for the reader of rising to that intellectual challenge, some laughs, not a few surprises, the unsettling thrill, unsettling being the key word, of self-recognition, and grave insight respecting that thorn that matters most, temptation to serious sin. All stirred by a knowing master. And have we noted the concision and brevity of this brew? All in all, a concoction very, very difficult to resist. But let us remember that Lewis was tutoring, lecturing, writing other books and articles, keeping up a very, very vast correspondence, growing, and contending with both blitz evacuees in his kilns and other difficulties of home life, as he was polishing off Screwtape. Now, from time to time, the New York C.S. Lewis Society, which by now you know I love dearly, has conducted its own Screwtape competition. We've invited people to write their own Screwtape letters and submit them. Here is my favorite entry. My dear Wormwood, you are mistaken to think that causing the boy to slap his sister is terribly good. That accomplishes little, though you are on the right track. The slap is good. That, however, takes the patient no farther than the enemy, which is always and only the whole point, than to have him argue honestly with his mother. When he merely slaps the girl, he is not committing a serious sin. But if you make him enjoy the act, cause him to look for opportunities to perform the act, if you compel him to do it more and more, then it is even better than good. The little things his sister does which annoy the boy should be kept in mind, in his mind. Keep repeating those venial habits which so irritate him. Remind him of all her irksome mannerisms and idiosyncrasies. Do not let him forget these things. Let these stay in his head, and like festering wounds, they will drive the patients to violence in the form of striking his symbol. That way, you will find you can control him easily. Exacting a smack will not be a matter of tempting him. It will only be a matter of reminding him. Thus, he will be safely on his way to our Father's house, your affectionate uncle, SCREWTAPE. Chilling, that. Don't you agree? Especially you parents of siblings, or anyone who has a sibling. Well, I remain as chilled today as I was some 30 years ago, when my own 12-year-old son wrote it. Particular letters hold a lesson worthy at least of a sermon, maybe in some cases of a book, even of an entire dissertation. Take letter 8. I know we have won many souls through pleasure, all the same. It is his invention, not ours. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce even one. The devil, in other words, is a parasite. He creates nothing. And did we not hear from letter number 22 that God is a hedonist at heart? Letter after letter not only advances the plot and contrapuntally unwinds the subplot, but mocks the devil by allowing him to take himself with the utmost seriousness, as Wormwood, bless his heart, subverts the bureaucracy with comedy skit incompetence. But most important is that along the way, and as though incidentally, Lewis pins us and our abuse of free will to the card. You are here, somewhere. And that is at the very heart of this masterpiece. A work of art ostensibly simple, that again and again gives us more bang for the buck than we had reckoned with, and finally delivers that straight right hand to our chin. How does Lewis know us so? How did he know me so well? He used a sort of joke, but at the end of the day, he is deadly serious. SCREWTAPE's greatest defeat is that the patient sees what all along has been going on around him. A real war for his soul was raging all along. As bumbling as your Wormwood may be, his Uncle SCREWTAPE is in deadly, omnivorous earnest. Right here, right now, and he does not sleep. On the other hand, SCREWTAPE and his master usually fail to reckon with the church triumphant and all its angels and saints. Neither do they sleep. Well, I'd like to widen the lens a bit from SCREWTAPE, as I suggested at the very beginning, and call some greater attention in a little bit more detail, there not being very much time, to Lewis himself. Next November 22nd marks the 50th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death. A death only very few people knew of at the time. Knowing that date, can you understand why? Indeed, it was the very same date that President Kennedy was killed. Only a very few people, those of us of a certain age, cliches, aren't we? Remember exactly where we were. Only very few people anywhere in the world were paying attention to anything else. But there were those few. One of them was Dr. Thomas Howard, who knows much more than a little something about the great man. In light of the anniversary, it seems fitting for us, I think, to reflect a bit on the life of the man who produced SCREWTAPE. That is, to widen the lens, as I said, from its tight focus on that single masterpiece, and to look, if not at the whole man who wrote it, then at least at a version of him. And how better to begin than by listening to a man who met him and who has written about him so authoritatively. I've known Tom for nearly 4 decades. He was among the earliest critics to tell us about Lewis's work. By the way, he's also told us about Charles Williams and T.S. Eliot. He is an elegant writer, an elegant thinker, and an elegant man, and very smart and very learned. Read Narnia and Beyond, A Guide to the Fiction of C.S. Lewis, and you will see what I mean. Well, can you tell how delighted I am to introduce him, even in absentia? Alas, ill health has prevented Tom from being able to join us this evening in person, but he has sent his thoughts along, And thanks to a reading by Alexandra Como Seguir, who, by the way, just happens to be the little sister referred to in the SCREWTAPE letter above that I read, Tom tells us how he came to know C.S. Lewis. Alexandra?
The conveners of this conference have asked if I would sketch in a few remarks about my own contacts with C.S. Lewis, both in correspondence and in a personal visit. I am happy to do so. My first contact with Lewis came in the 1940s, when I was a schoolboy. An older sister of mine came home from college one vacation, talking about an odd book she had been reading. It was entitled The SCREWTAPE Letters. If you have heard of this book, you will know that it contains what purport to be some letters from an elder devil named SCREWTAPE to his nephew Wormwood, whom he's training in the art of tempting Christians. Of course, I found myself encountering all too familiar stuff. That old devil had tried out virtually all of his tricks and tactics on me, very often, alas, with total success. The book ushered me into a glorious universe, I should say, of C.S. Lewis. To this day, 70 years later, I find myself regaled by his theological works, his literary scholarship and criticism, his Christian apologetics, and, to my mind perhaps best of all, his imaginative works, namely the Chronicles of Narnia, the so-called Space Trilogy, which I suspect Lewis would have preferred to be called the Deep Heaven Trilogy, and, to my mind, his crowning success, Till We Have Faces, which is Lewis's reworking of the Cupid and Psyche myth. I think I can say, without exaggeration, that it has been the writings of C.S. Lewis that have, in effect, formed my entire picture of the moral order of the universe, what he called the whole show. To my mind, his picture of the dance, that radiant, solemn, fixed, majestic, and thunderously beautiful order of things. This picture that stands at a polar distance from modern assumptions about things, namely the notions that all things celestial, intergalactic, angelic, human, animal, vegetable, and inanimate are merely the result of blind chance. It was during my college days that the Chronicles of Narnia appeared. Something perverse in me, something truculent, I would say, in retrospect now, kept me from looking into them just then. I think my idea was that since everyone was so manifestly exuberant about these books, I would not climb onto any such bandwagon. And I shamefacedly admit that this was to my own impoverishment. Eventually, of course, I came to these chronicles, and again, of course, I found myself regaled. Also, at about that time, a friend of mine kept plucking at my sleeve about another of Lewis's books, That Hideous Strength. Lewis had written this in the 1940s, and the somber truth of the matter is that it could have been written tomorrow morning. Lewis's mordant perspicuity in seeing exactly what was happening, not only in academic circles, but in the juggernaut of philosophical and moral speculation as to the nature of things, he saw this trend could only lead to the collapse of civilization as we know it. I would to this day recommend it as perhaps the most useful handbook on the peril that now confronts our mortal life. My correspondence with Lewis began in about 1958 when I was in the Army at Fort Benning, Georgia. I had been assigned as a chaplain's assistant, which did not mean that you were religious, it meant that you could type. As it turned out, I found myself with vast amounts of leisure time for reading. A friend sent me the first volume of Tolkien's massive myth, The Fellowship of the Ring. The book was entitled The Hobbit. Like everyone else, I was ravished. But in my zeal, I fired off a letter, not to Tolkien, but to Lewis. I think it was because I knew how I could reach Lewis at Magdalen College, Oxford, but I did not know exactly where I could find Tolkien himself. In any event, I wrote off rhapsodically to Lewis, and presently I got the following letter from him. Dear Mr. Howard, oh, but believe me, you are still only paddling, that's British for wading, in the glorious sea of Touhey. Go on from The Hobbit at once to The Lord of the Rings. 3 volumes and nearly as long as the Bible, and not a word too long, except for the first chapter, which is a botch. Don't be put off by it. Lewis thought that Tolkien's account of Bilbo's birthday party was frivolous and tedious. The Hobbit is merely a fragment of his myth, detached and adapted for children, and losing much by the adaptation. The Lord of the Rings is the real stuff. Thank you for all the nice things you say about my own little efforts. Yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis. In my youthful naivete, I suppose that this letter gave me warrant to correspond with Lewis. Those of you who know anything of Lewis's biography will know that writing letters to the thousands of enthusiasts who felt as I did, that this constituted perhaps the most dreary and onerous element in Lewis's life. But he soldiered on at it, all of it written with pen and ink. So over the next few years, I had a number of exchanges with Lewis, as often as not by postcard, since I was in the habit of using this brief method, and I didn't want to swamp him with letters. He always, heaven's blessings light upon his weary head, replied. Then, in 1961, I found myself teaching at a boys' school in England. At the Easter holiday that year, I visited an American friend of mine who was at Queen's College, Oxford, doing a graduate degree in law. And it occurred to me that I might pop out to Headington Quarry, where Lewis lived, just outside of Oxford, for a conversation. Again, of course, I look back on my presumption with the most embarrassed of feelings. But, in reply to my postcard, Lewis wrote out directions as how to get to the Kilns, which was the name of his house. I took the bus, it was only a short ride, and alighted at the point which he had indicated. One followed a little dirt road with row of trees. It's all built up with terrible houses now, and presently found the Kilns on the left. I knocked at the door, and Lewis himself answered. Mr. Howard! Rang out in his jovial, bell-like voice. He acted as though nothing could have pleased him more. He looked the very image of what one had hoped he would look like. A large bald head, a rubicund face with twinkly eyes, a shapeless tweed jacket, and baggy flannel trousers. He led me into a small parlor, furnished with appalling, overstuffed chairs, done up in mud-colored velvet. We talked for about 45 minutes, I think. I had at least a rag of modesty, which suggested that I might make my visit short. This was in the days before any electronic recording devices. They were clumsy tape recorders back then. And I didn't want to sit and scribble notes while he talked like a tiresome reporter or an eager votary. I was most certainly one of his eager votaries, but I didn't want to seem like one. So I have only sketchy memories of the topics we conversed. I mentioned various things in his writings that had especially arrested my attention. The Robin in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, or Lucy, or Coriolan, the old man doing his purgatory in The Voyage of the Dom Treader. In that connection, I think I must have disclosed my then Protestantism by intimating that purgatory might be an idea rather than an actual state of affairs. His lapidary remark was, there might be such a place. Certainly it was the various characters that appeared in his tales that had specially vivified my own understandings of the nature of good and evil. Wither, Frost, Lord Feverstone and that hideous strength, Weston and Paralandra, Shift the ape in the last battle, and even poor Oral until we have faces. The tyranny of pride and self-delusion in this noble woman, who was clearly en route to freedom and sanctity, it would be hard to find another such treatment of the power of evil in an otherwise well-intentioned person, who eventually does, thanks be to God, win through to true nobility. Among my own favorites of Lewis's work would be The Discarded Image, his study of the medieval world view, which admits is not true. but one knows perfectly well that he loves this outlook, and that he believes that it is indeed, in the deepest sense, true, in ways that no Hubble telescope, nor accelerator, nor cloud chamber can ever disclose. And his preface to Paradise Lost, his treatment here of ritual and ceremony on pages 17 and 21, in connection with Milton's poetical achievement, is, to my mind, the best thing I have ever read on the topic. A Grief Observed, his remorselessly courageous and candid account of his own grief at the death of his beloved wife, Joy. Here, again, one feels that no other scrutiny of grief has handled the subject with such agonizing clarity, without any tincture of self-display or weakness. And the volumes of his letters, such a record of crystalline clarity of mind, and of muscular, intellectual, and moral integrity, and of modesty, wit, and humor. Such a record has only very few parallels. My debt then to this giant Christian philosopher, apologist, critic, and spinner of enchantments is quite simply overwhelming. And I earnestly hope that all you here are, or will be, overwhelmed as well by C.S. Lewis.
Well, we see that the Tisch School of the Arts is well represented this evening. Tom, wherever you are, I expect you'll see this. You have brought Lewis forth, even your absentia. Know that we thank you for it, and that we all wish you very well, by the way. And thank you, sweetheart, for working that out. Now, with the master on stage, we can take a few more minutes, as I promised earlier, to get to know him, after which I think there'll be time for some questions and answers. If you have any of the answers, I have the questions. And I remind myself, as I always do in a case like this, you can't say it all, so don't even try. Lewis, it's important to know, born in 1898, was an Irishman from Belfast. That's important. If you've ever been to Belfast, if you've ever been into the Hollywood Hills and have read Narnia, you've recognized Lewis's birthplace in Narnia. That's the landscape. That's the Narnian landscape. He was very close in a close-knit family. His mother, Flora Hamilton Lewis, a brilliant woman with degrees from Queen's College in logic and mathematics. This is the mid-19th century. His father, Albert, a solicitor, and a good one too, who was kind of intrusive in his son's life, talkative man, and his brother, his best friend, Warren Lewis, known as Warnie. The key event of his childhood was his mother's death, just before he turned 10. He described it as a continent sinking beneath the sea. Terrible event. And in my judgment, was the beginning of what would become his atheism. He went away to school, a private school, a boarding school, as was the custom then, and hated them. We don't know which was worse. Did he hate the schools more, or did the schools hate him more? Because he never managed to fit in, so he was taken out and given over to a tutor, W.T. Kirkpatrick, known as the Great Knock, who had tutored Albert Lewis and Warren Lewis, and now had Jack Lewis. And this was a man not to be trifled with. By the way, a devoted atheist, Kirkpatrick. This reinforced Lewis's growing atheism. The Great Knock was the kind of man, as I said, you didn't trifle with. On first meeting him, Lewis said, "What a very beautiful day, isn't it, sir?" And the Great Knock said, "What do you mean by beautiful, and on what grounds do you apply that definition to this day?" And Lewis realized he was in for a hard ride. He became the most brilliant classical scholar Kirkpatrick had ever tutored. His Latin and Greek became like history. And needless to say, he got into Oxford and would win a very rare triple first at Oxford. Just a brilliant student. That education was interrupted by service in World War I, which, by the way, he volunteered for. As an Irishman, he was not compelled to military service. He was wounded. He would carry shrapnel in his chest for the rest of his life. And, it's useful to note, took prisoners. In fact, took dozens of German prisoners at the same time. He was scolded for this by his sergeant. It seems that when Lewis took these prisoners, he didn't take out his sidearm and aim it at them. And the sergeant said, "For goodness sakes, Lewis, at least you could have drawn your pistol when you brought them in." How did this happen? Well, it was either surrender to the French, which the Germans knew better than to do, or drop their guns, put up their hands, and follow this young second lieutenant behind the lines. He had met a man named Patty Moore, whom he served with. They made a mutual vow to each other. If one died, the other would take care of the dead man's family. Patty Moore was killed in action. And Lewis inherited Patty's young sister, Maureen, who was 9 years old, and Patty's mother, Mrs. Moore, whose tangled web would enmesh Lewis for the next decades to come. For those who didn't know better, Mrs. Moore seemed to be Lewis's mother. In fact, he would sometimes introduce Mrs. Moore as his mother because it just made things simpler. In fact, Mrs. Moore was a married woman, and there is considerable evidence that Lewis, later on in his 20s, had some sort of sexual liaison with Mrs. Moore, which came to a dramatic hold at his conversion. He stayed at Oxford until 1954, first as a tutor and a don, becoming more and more prominent as a lecturer. And then in 1954, and you must appreciate what a big deal this is, moved to Cambridge University. I mean, this is just treason. And there he was because they offered him a chair, a professorial chair in English, medieval and Renaissance English literature, which they created especially for C.S. Lewis, and which he got through the secret machinations of Tolkien. Lewis knew nothing about the chair until it was offered, but it was Tolkien behind the scenes who made it happen, a devoted friend. During this time in the 50s, he marries Joy Davidman, an American from the Bronx, from the Grand Concourse of all places. And she had been a Jew. She left Judaism for communism. She left communism for Scientology after having married Bill Gresham. You may not know the name Bill Gresham, but you might know the novel Nightmare Alley. And if you don't know the novel Nightmare Alley, then do know the film starring Tyrone Power, which is magnificent, and it made the Greshams a lot of money. But that wasn't enough for Joy. She became a Christian through the influence of C.S. Lewis, went to England to nab him. She did. They were married in 1957. In spite of cancer that was in remission. There's a very interesting story about that, which we may have time for. And then died in 1960. And Lewis would then die in 1963. Contrary to the depiction of Lewis in the movie Shadowlands, he did not mope melancholically for the last 3 years of his life. In fact, he might have proposed marriage to the poet Ruth Pitter, who very well might have accepted, but for the fact